and so on. It goes on. And Robert Graves studied this poem in his famous book, The White Goddess, and he reckons that it's got encoded into it a kind of a bardic initiatory transmission. And yes, it certainly does. I'm not convinced that he, uncoded it in the only way possible. I think he had a really amazing crack at it because he was, of course, a great classical scholar. His father was a great Celtic scholar. And not many people realise that really it was his father that made Robert Graves so interested in matters of Celtic mysteries. It was his father, who was Alfred Percival Graves, who lived from 1846 to 1931, was himself a poet and an anthologist born in Dublin. And he, was an amazing writer and helped raise his son into the same mysteries. And Alfred Graves actually retired to Wales, which he called Edinfa, meaning towards Ireland, where he died. There's a great love between the Welsh and the Irish, and also a sort of friendly competition. So I want to move on now and quote from another tradition entirely, which is that of Mary Magdalene, because this I am tradition is universal. It's there in the Upanishads of India, it's there in the Druid poems, and it's also in the Gnostic Christian esoteric tradition. And in the Gnostic Gospels and Gnostic writings that were found at Nag Hammadi in Egypt by some Bedouin boys in 1945, was discovered an amazing poem, among many other things, which is called The Thunder Perfect Mind. And this poem was read out in full by Lee Strasberg at our recent Mary Magdalene Studies conference. I'm not going to read the whole of it. I'm going to read just the first beginning of it. And you'll see it's from the same place as these other works. I was sent forth from the power, and I have come to those who reflect upon me. And I have been found among those who would seek after me. Look upon me, you who reflect upon me, and you hearers, hear me. You who are waiting for me, take me to yourselves, and do not banish me from your sight. And do not make your voice hate me, nor your hearing. Do not be ignorant of me, anywhere or at any time. Be on your guard. Do not be ignorant of me. For I am the first and the last. I am the honoured one and the scorned one. I am the whore and the holy one. I am the wife and the virgin. I am the mother and the daughter. I am the members of my mother. I am the barren one, and yet many are her sons. I am she whose wedding is great, and I have not taken a husband. I am the midwife, and she who does not bear. I am the solace of my labour pains. I am the bride and the bridegroom. And it is my husband who begot me. I am the mother of my father and the sister of my husband, and he is my offspring. I am the slave of him who prepared me. I am the ruler of my offspring. But he is the one who begot me before the time on a birthday, and he is my offspring in due time and my power is from him. I am the staff of his power in his youth, and he is the rod of my old age. And whatever he wills happens to me. I am the silence that is incomprehensible, and the idea whose remembrance is frequent. I am the voice whose sound is manifold, and the word whose appearance is multiple. I am the utterance of my name. So that's a quote of the beginning of Thunder Perfect Mind, which is much studied by Gnostic scholars and experts in comparative religion, and it's got all kinds of fascinating origins and antecedents. And one of them may well be the ancient Egyptian mystery traditions. You know, it was found in Egypt, and it's part of the Gnostic canons, and Gnosis is really part of the ancient Egyptian or Hermetic wisdom, from which Christianity, Judaism, and later Islam all drew sustenance. You know, the ancient Egyptian religion was extremely old and ancient, and its teachings were oral, but they did invent writing. They invented, obviously, hieroglyphs, which told cosmic mysteries, which they painted on the tombs and on the coffins, and scribes learned to use them. They were invented or discovered by Thoth, who was the god of wisdom. When the Greeks turned up in Egypt in about 600 BC, and their wisdom teachers like Orpheus and then Pythagoras and then Plato, they all went to Egypt to learn and study. If you read the books by Edward Shure, he talks about this and reconstructs, you know, their time in Egypt. It's fascinating stuff. Peter Kingsley talks about this as well. You know, and many other scholars. This is not sort of conjecture, it's fact. They went to study the mysteries, and again, it was oral teaching combined with some writing, and also some mathematics, because the Egyptians were building their pyramids away and had to know geometry very well. They helped invent geometry. So the Greeks kind of learned a lot of their geometry skills from the Egyptians. But there was a wonderful blending between the Greeks and the Egyptians. The Greeks brought their own restless intellect and their own philosophical acumen. And when they developed this, eventually under Alexander, they founded Alexandria, a great city which became the haven for intellectuals in that whole region of the world. Had one of the biggest libraries, probably the biggest library in the world at that time, which has been refounded, by the way. You can go to Alexandria and study there. And the Greeks decided that Thoth, the god of the Egyptians, was most likely best described in their pantheon as Hermes, because Hermes was a very, very quick thinker. He was Mercury. He's the planet that whizzes around the sun. He's Mercury that you can't pick up. It's so clever and tricky. And he was the god of communication, Hermes, between this realm of the earth and the supernatural kingdoms of the gods. You know, he would travel. You might meet him in disguise. He might appear to you on the road, on the beach in Brighton, on the journey, you know, to Athens from Ephesus, and you might not know it's him even, but you might see him in dreams. I mean, he's really the god of the internet now. And so they crafted together what's called the Hermetic Mysteries, which was the Thoth tradition of the Egyptians, written down in Demotic Greek, and also in Demotic Egyptian. And it explains the metaphysics behind the I Am poems, such as the Isis traditions, and you know, there are similar I Am poems in the Isis tradition. I'm going to read a few quotes from the Hermetic Mysteries. Again, I've recorded the reading of the entire thing on my Green University website. You can listen to it as an audio book. But this is just a little glimpse, and I'm hoping, if I have time, to complete an entire commentary on it. And finishing off the Quran, and then the Hermetic mysteries are probably next in the line. This is from Asclepius, Book 3. The divine mind is wholly of like nature with eternity. It is motionless in itself, but though stable, is yet self-moving. It is holy and incorruptible and everlasting, and has all attributes, yet higher, if higher there be, than can be assigned to the eternal life of the Supreme God, that life which stands fast in absolute reality. It is wholly filled with all things imperceptible to sense, and with all-embracing knowledge. It is, so to speak, consubstantial with God. The cosmic mind is the recipient of all sensible forms and of all kinds of knowledge of sensible things. You know, it's a little glimpse of the metaphysics of the Hermetica, because if this cosmic mind, or divine mind, as that text calls it, or as I call it, the divine intelligence, permeates everything, every manifest thing, every animal, every atom, including me and you and our consciousness, then I am at one with them. You know, the divine mind is in me as it is in all manifest forms. And therefore, if I find that divine mind within myself, through study, prayer, theurgy, whatever, you know, there are many techniques, then I will automatically resonate with it in other beings, other persons, other people, but even other animals and things in nature, everything in nature, the sea. And that's where the poems of the Druids come from, because they didn't read the Hermetica, but they had access to the same wisdom, mystery teachings in their schools. And it's thought some Druids actually did go to Egypt and study in their schools. They were wandering sages. And in my Encyclopedia of Druid Studies, I've tried to go into how often the Druids travelled about. We know that Abaris, for instance, went to meet Pythagoras. We know that Pythagoras had been to Egypt. So, you know, there were transmissions. The sages of all times have been in touch with each other. So, yes, of course, so Taliesin will say, I am the waves. I am the billows of the waves. You know, I am the thought in the mind of God that created the letters. It's coming from the same metaphysics. And that, to me, is what I love about the work I'm doing with the World Intellectual Forum, because what we're trying to do is access that divine consciousness. What is that active intellect, as Aristotle called it, that is behind all the religions, behind all the outer forms? You know, where is the seership within Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Jainism? Because it's there in them all. And I'm explaining in detail in my commentaries, you know, how. So a couple more goodies. This is really just a feast. Another great Greek philosopher, Iamblichus, who came later, he was a Neoplatonic, Neo-Pythagorean thinker. He wrote a fascinating book on the mysteries of the Egyptians, Chaldeans, and Assyrians. And he was very interested as a philosopher in how divine consciousness can access how the human mind can access and work with divine consciousness. Because if we can tune into the daimons, as he calls it, which are the sort of active qualities operating within the overall divine consciousness, we can learn to work with them. and we can then begin to manifest. And so we can begin to sort of operate, we can become a vehicle for the transmission of divine consciousness into this world. Just a little quote from him, chapter 21. I think, therefore, that all who are lovers of the contemplation of theurgic truth will acknowledge this, that the piety which pertains to divine natures ought not to be exercised towards them partially or imperfectly. Hence, since prior to the appearance of the gods, all such powers are pre-subjacent to them, are moved, and when the gods are about to descend to the earth, precede them as in a solemn procession, he who does not distribute to all these powers that which is adapted to them, and does not honour each in an appropriate manner, will depart imperfect and destitute of the participation of the gods. But he who propitiates all of them and offers to each acceptable gifts, and such as are to the utmost of his powers adapted to them, will always remain secure and irreprehensible, giving completion in a perfect manner to the perfect and entire receptacle of the divine choir. What he's saying is that the divine mind, the absolute, the one, the God, the Allah, manifests when, by the time it gets down into human form, in multiplicity, plurality, many humans, many types, many races, many many continents, many cultures, many languages. Everything is many, many here. The one is, the one, the absolute, but it incarnates down into its differentiation. And hence the idea of a pantheon arises. So the Egyptians who knew this, and the Greeks, and the Assyrians and Babylonians, and Phoenicians, they said, look, we have to also worship the manyness of the gods. Not just the unity of the Godhead, who is the source of it all, the divine intelligence, but also the divine intelligences, plural, which then manifest as the elements, earth, air, fire, water, but also the different animal kingdoms, the plant kingdoms, the different types of humans and cultures and religions and so on. So, to really do justice in piety to the one, we have to also honour the many. And this is something that in my commentary on the Quran I'm explaining that Muhammad, it was a lesson Muhammad never learned, unfortunately. There was no real higher education available in Mecca and Medina for a budding prophet, for a Taliesin in the Meccan tradition. You know, he couldn't, he had to self-teach and self-download, and he had no one that was capable of bouncing up against with his ideas. And I'm explaining in my commentary on the Quran a sort of critical evaluation of, where he kind of didn't get that quite right, because he never had the chance to sit at the feet of someone like Iamblichus or Plato, whose teaching was about plurality and duality are part of the one and the good. It's not like they're in opposition. You see, Muhammad was at war with the pagans of Mecca. Obviously there was no one in Mecca who had the intelligence to take him on and discuss theology with him, to do what my friend, Terry Dobney calls disputation. A Druid is, you publicly dispute in honour of the gods. But no, nobody in Mecca had the brains to actually talk to Muhammad about these weighty matters, presumably because there were no really well qualified pagan priests in Mecca at the time, or Medina, which is sad. And in my commentary on the Quran I said that if I could be telescoped back into time travel and go back to Mecca in the 7th century AD and try and mediate between the pagan Meccans and the Muhammad unity Muslims, I would have, I think, successfully got a mediation, because I did set up the only interfaith mediation service in the world. It's still running in '95. We haven't yet invented time travel, so I don't know how to do it retrospectively, but we can do it now post hoc. And what I would have said to both sides is that they're both partly right and partly wrong. Yes, God is a unity, Allah is the divine intelligence, but also so are the gods. They're part of it. Otherwise, why would Allah have created these different spirits and different elements and so on? So we have to honour each other. The many and the one have to declare a peace treaty. And that is what Iamblichus is saying. And that is true piety. It's showing true piety to the one to love the many, because the one has created the many. So, you know, and I think the Druid wisdom is that, yes, I am all of that. I am earth, I am fire, I am water. The I am is the one, but it becomes and delights to become the billows, the sea, the lover, the roebuck, the tree, etc. And also, this knowledge is given also in ancient, what we can call magic, I suppose. The Arcana Mundi is a collection by George Luck of prayers and teachings about magic from the ancient world. And it's a fascinating collection, which shows how deeply spiritual the ancient world was in the Greek tradition. And I'm just looking for the appropriate passage to read. There's a discussion in Plutarch, who was a very wise, learned Greek philosopher from Delphi, who wrote a book called On the Cessation of Oracles. He wanted to know, did oracles still exist? And how do they work? How can prophets give oracles? Delphi, of course, was the place of oracular wisdom for, ever since about 1500 BC, there'd been sacred buildings at Delphi since the Mycenaean age. And they'd grown and grown and become a huge oracular centre connected to Apollo. Here's a quote from the dialogue on the cessation of oracles. Lamprias said, "It is really naive and childish to believe that the God himself enters the body of the prophet and speaks forth, using his lips and his voice as an instrument. For if you mix up a God with human functions, you violate his majesty, and you disregard his dignity and the excellence of his nature." Cleombrotus answers, "You are right, but since it is difficult to grasp and define how providence enters, and to what point one should let it enter, some maintain that the God has absolutely nothing to do with it, while others see in him the cause of everything. Both positions are equally far from a balanced and responsible view. I agree with those who say that Plato, when he discovered the element which underlies all created qualities, the element which is now called matter and nature, relieved philosophers of many serious problems. But there are those who have discovered that the race of daimons, halfway between gods and men, communicates the gods, but communicates between the gods and mankind, and establishes a relationship between them and us. It is irrelevant whether this theory goes back to the Magi who followed Zoroaster, or is Thracian and belongs to Orpheus, or is Egyptian or Phrygian, as we may guess from seeing how the ritual of both of the latter countries includes many themes relating to death and mourning, and that these form part of their ceremonies and liturgies. Among the Greeks, Homer seems to use both terms indifferently. He sometimes calls the gods daimons. Hesiod was the first to distinguish clearly and explicitly between three different classes of rational beings: the gods, the heroes, and mankind. This means that he believed in a transformation by which the men of the Golden Age became good daemons in great numbers, and by which some of the demigods were admitted to the ranks of the heroes. Hesiod also thinks that death comes to daemons at the end of certain periods of time. The sum total of a daemon's life span is 9,727 years. Good old Plutarch, you know, he was an inveterate searcher after truths. I want to mention, since we're discussing Delphi, that I'm also involved with the Delphic Games. And I've just been appointed educational coordinator for the Delphic Games worldwide. This is a great honour, and today, the 1st of August, Lughnasadh, 2021, you know, I've been mandated as educational outreach coordinator for the Games. Now, so let me talk a bit about the Games, where Plutarch came from, what he was involved with. We have now the Olympic Games going on in Tokyo. Everyone knows about this. We're watching it on telly. You know, it's all very exciting, and people running very fast, throwing things, jumping over long jumps and high jumps, and doing gymnastics. It's sport, you know, physical stuff, which is really exciting. But that's only part of the curriculum for the planet. The planet, as Keats said, is a school for souls. We're all here in incarnation to learn. And we also need to learn the arts, culture, music, dance, poetry, seership, prophetic skills, scholarship, philosophy, the life of the intellect. And the Greeks, who'd thought of everything, had other games for that. They had the Delphic Games, which took place also every 4 years in a synchronized disjunction with the Olympic Games, so that every 2 years there was either the Delphic Games or the Olympic Games. And all the great poets, playwrights, musicians, dancers would go to Delphi and compete. The whole thing was a peace project, because the ancients loved peace, although they were really tough fighters, the Greeks. And I mean, just have to look at Leonidas and the Thermopylae Pass. I mean, 300 Spartans held off a huge army. I mean, they were really brilliant fighters, but they didn't want to fight. They loved peace better. And the Delphic Games are the peace celebration. You couldn't compete in the Delphic Games if your city-state was at war with another city-state. So there had to be like a general overall truce. Now, we would like to bring that back. I would like to see, you know, a major international Delphic Games every 4 years, and a world truce is declared. All the fighters put their arms down, and they go and compete in the games instead. So send poets from Iran, send poets from Israel, from Yemen, send dancers from Afghanistan, send musicians from, you know, America and Russia and so on. Let's rebirth these Delphic Games. So they've started, and it's a great pleasure to be now associated with their educational side. And I want to quote just briefly from this classic book, A Study of Divination in Ancient Greece and Augury, because the Greeks and the Romans were deeply interested in how we can know and discern the future, how we can understand the meaning of events. I mean, you know, it's still a crucial thing, I believe that the revival of the Delphic Games, I'd like to see a revival of the Delphic arts of prophetic oracular seership as well. I'd like to see a temple to Apollo rebuilt and re-staffed in Delphi and elsewhere which was sacred to Apollo. That's what the Hyperborean Apollo temple of Stonehenge was about. The Druids were known to worship Hyperborean Apollo, which means Apollo beyond the north wind, in the cold, And so that's why I want to see a spiritual pilgrimage centre set up somewhere near Stonehenge and Avebury, where seers can come and train, they can visit Stonehenge, they can commune with the ancestors and the kami and the spirits of the land, because they're all still there. And so on this day, Lughnasadh, there would have been tremendous festivals and events going on at Avebury and Stonehenge. So here's a little passage from localities of confirmed sanctity. The vague nymphs tended to be ousted by the stronger personality of hero or god. And with the exception of the cave of the Spharagitides on Mount Kithaeron, their inspiration is rather connected with certain prophetic persons or victims than with specific wells or caves. Mr. Lawson has given an admirable description of the wandering madman whose maunderings are received with awe in modern Greece. The ancients would have spoken of him as of Bacchus, as divinely possessed. And possession by the nymphs was the source of the inspiration of many of the traditional poets and prophets, lymphatiki. The muses themselves were a subdivision of the nymphs. As Callios wandered around a lake, he heard the voice of nymphs, whom the Lydians call muses, and was taught music. Of the circumstances under which possession took place, we have little information. There are, of course, the husbands of nymphs. True Thomas obtained his powers from his relations with the queen of the fairies, and Daphnis from his nymph lovers. Numa Pompilius again finds a parallel in the mayor of a modern Greek community. Of the more general conditions under which the doubtful privilege of being possessed by the nymphs might be conferred, we know but little. Nymphs haunted lonely places, and the heat of midday has always been a dangerous time in Greece. In the British Isles, those who slept on green hills at sundown or entered fairy rings at night were liable to put themselves in the power of the spirits. But we are all too ignorant about the muses and the nymphs who gave to Hesiod and Bacchus their mantic lore. So, there's a lot of work to be done in researching all this. And if the muses, as Plato said, were the originators of our education, and therefore he dedicated the academy to the 9 muses, what was he saying? He was saying that true wisdom is a spiritual descent. It's like a prophetic initiation for us. Now that's what the true academic does. So you study your branch of discipline knowledge, your scientific knowledge, but you have to receive inspiration as a download from that divine intelligence. Going back to Iamblichus, it has to come from the higher source. And I think this is the next. I mean, the World Economic Forum wants a 4th industrial revolution. We in the World Intellectual Forum want the 3rd